Welcome to a time of holy human stuff. My name is Heather Murray Elkins, and I'd like to begin this series, which I have called Purple Prose, by reading a poem that provides at least a little explanation for the hair color at the moment that I am wearing. When I am an old woman, I shall wear purple, with a red hat, which doesn't go and doesn't suit me. And I shall spend my pension on brandy and summer gloves and satin sandals and say, we've no money for butter. I shall sit down by the pavement when I'm tired and gobble up samples in the shops and press alarm bells and run my stick along the public railings and make up for all the sobriety of my youth. I shall go out in my slippers in the rain and pick flowers from other people's gardens and learn to spit. You can wear terrible shirts and grow more fat and eat 3 pounds of sausages at a go, or only bread and pickle for a week, and hoard pens and pencils and beer mats and things in boxes. But now we must have clothes that keep us dry and pay our rent and not swear in the street and set a good example for the children. We must have friends to dinner and read the papers. But maybe I ought to practice a little now so that the people who know me are not too shocked and surprised when suddenly I am old and start to wear purple. I am deeply grateful for Jenny Joseph and that poem. And there are many reasons to wear purple, not only because one is growing old and wants to celebrate that fact. There's a way in which choosing what you do with your hair, particularly if you're a woman, is a matter of public witness. It is a public gesture. It says something. And several years ago, when a group of feminists and I decided to work on a book called Wising Up, and these were ritual resources for women of faith in their journey of aging, I decided to tackle the notion of to die or not to die. Now that's a very important question for a woman of any age these days. To die or not to die. And I started my research by interviewing women in 2 different retirement communities because I was curious as to why they dyed their hair, if they dyed their hair. Because the public perception of women and hair and aging, it becomes a ritual. At least according to the advertisers, a woman spots her first gray hair and laments. It's a sign of aging. And the response, the proper response is grief and die. So I wanted to explore women's both acts of acceptance and resistance to this notion of inevitability, what you do with the hair that begins to change color. And I ran across a wonderful motivating quote from P.G. Wodehouse. And his suggestion I did not want to follow. It says, there's only one cure for gray hair. It was invented by a Frenchman, and it's called the guillotine. So we don't want to chop our heads off when our hair begins to go gray. Now, there is also a biblical tradition regarding women in hair and what you should cover up, though I don't think Paul was thinking at all about the colors that were available to women. See 1 Corinthians 11, 4 through 15. But almost no one I talked about connected it to Paul's strange injunction about women and covering their heads because you would tempt the angels. No, they didn't make any connection about women's hair and theology. I have dyed my hair now for about 2 decades. And I'm, before the purple stage, a redhead by choice. God didn't do it. I wish God had. So I wanted to be red. And I thought when I turned 70, I'd go purple. And I have to say that that choice of red was a theological act of resistance, not just an agency of choice. It was a theological act of resistance, a public declaration of feminist intent. Now, it certainly didn't start that way. No, it started when I was in the Midwest. I had been invited by the preacher to come and do a series of sermons. And I had been invited almost a year and a half before the date was to occur. So I arrived. But on the arrival, I discovered what had happened over that period of time between invitation and arrival was something called reimagining. And reimagining was, and it's an anniversary of 25 years in 2018, was when women gathered for a discourse, a public conversation about theology. And it was a sense of being able to conceive and receive and reimagine some of the faith traditions that they shared. It was ecumenical. It was well attended. And you could say all hell broke loose after it happened. Some of the difficulty and some of the conversation that turned into, in some places, accusations was based around this text, Wisdom's Feast, and the recovery for Protestants of this understanding of the language of Sophia, and the way in which the biblical studies that Roman Catholics had done for several decades were making their way into public discourse. At any rate, for a variety of reasons, by the time I arrived, I had been labeled not an evangelist, not someone who was coming to preach the gospel, but as a heretic, a goddess worshiper, because I wanted to retrieve this biblical tradition that had a name, Sophia. And when I got there, I discovered that I wasn't going to be allowed to preach from the pulpit. The pastor was very regretful, but he had people that were going to protest, and they wouldn't let me use their pulpit. So I stood in the aisle that first evening because I am baptized into the life and death and resurrection of Christ. And even if I stood in the aisle, what I could witness to was my faith. But I have to say, the next morning I thought, how am I going to do two more from the aisle? And there weren't very many people who came. A lot of people were protesting. And I have to say I was fairly discouraged. So I went downtown and I found a beauty salon, and I thought, I'll just get my hair cut and fixed and that'll make me feel better. It was sort of a mousy brown, and I was quite happy with it, but I just thought, a good haircut might help. So I sat in the chair, I took off my glasses, and she began working, and I promptly fell asleep. I was really tired. When I woke up, however, there was a significant shock, because my hair was only this long. Well, I had left. I looked like I had been almost scalped. And I finally, after not knowing what to say, I'm staring at my almost bald head in the mirror, and I say to the woman, why did you do that? And she said, well, you didn't say anything, so I kept cutting. I looked at my reflection and suddenly realized something. I never understood that part in the Bible where to shame a group that you have conquered, a tribe you have conquered, you shave the women's head. It was deeply shaming. And I also suddenly experienced what many of my friends who had dealt with cancer experienced. The loss of hair is traumatic. My hair was this long. So I said, go to the back and find the brightest, reddest color you can find. I mean, fire engine red, like exit sign red, and you have to dye my hair. Because I couldn't go back that night and let people assume I just had a bad hair day, a terrible hair day. It had to mean something. And they were treating me like a flaming heretic, so I thought I'd just look like one. When I walked in, there were no bodies guarding the sanctity of the pulpit. They were too shocked, those who had come. They just stared at my head. So I walked up and delivered my sermon from behind the pulpit, and I know they didn't hear a word I said. And so it went. The pastor and I agreed there was no point in a third evening because very few people, he said everyone was talking about it, but I thought, I think we're done now. They're not hearing the gospel that I had come prepared to share. So I pack my bags and fly home early. So I'm thinking to myself, how do I explain this when I get home? Because I didn't leave looking this way. So I walk in, and the story's in here if you want to check it. I walk in, and my husband, Bill, can't think of anything to say. He's just looking at me. But then my son comes by, and he's 60. And much more matter of fact. And he looks at me and says, Mom, if you were to change your sexual orientation, you'd tell us first, wouldn't you? To which I said, yes, but this is not about sexuality. This is about theology. It was an act of resistance. And so for easily 12 years or more, I dyed my hair whatever shade red suited me. And some people assumed it meant things. Certain shades meant things, but they didn't. It was just whatever pleased me. It was a form of both theological resistance and agency. And so is this now. When I am old, I will wear purple, and I will mean it.